Hey everybody, and welcome to Autumnly at Home. Today we are going to practice pressure canning ground beef. If you are new to preserving food and pressure canning or water bath canning, this channel is the perfect place for you to get started. I have a playlist that I will stick on to the end of this video that you can also follow. Please like, subscribe, and share below so that we can create a community together where we learn one new thing at a time. I know canning can be a little scary to get started, especially pressure canning, but this is why I think that it's wonderful to create that community and try to encourage one another. And if I'm going to be completely honest, I was nervous to get started with this ground beef, but once I finished and now that I'm looking back on it, it was a lot more simpler than I thought it was. So let's go ahead and get started. Regulations now say that you do not have to sterilize your jars prior to water bath canning or pressure canning. However, you do want to start off with clean jars. So here I'm taking the time to make sure that all of my jars are nice and clean. I will link in the description below the website that you can go and look at, and that way you can look at it and read through it too to familiarize yourself with it. And I will link a playlist at the end of this where I also go through and talk about the difference between water bath canning, pressure canning. That way, if you're new to this, you can go ahead and start becoming familiarized with all the different pieces and the difference between both pots and why you would use one pot versus the other and all of those details. I have a video that I do in that playlist that talks about the difference, as well as other videos that if you're nervous to get started, then you can go ahead and do those as well. One of the areas that I would strongly recommend if you've never pressure canned, never water bath canned, anything like that, I would start with applesauce with water bath canning. That is such a good spot to get started because it's so simple. Today, we are going to be doing ground beef and pressure canning it. So I was so nervous when I got started this, but it ended up being a lot simpler than I thought it would be. So if you're new to pressure canning, not water bath canning, but pressure canning, ground beef is a really good place to start. You use the pressure canner for non-acidic foods such as green beans, meats, potatoes, things like that that don't have a high acidity level. So tomatoes, apples, applesauce, those are all great for water bath canning, but because we're doing the ground beef today, it requires the pressure canner to be on the safe side. That is what is suggested and approved, that we use the pressure canner for this and not water bath canner. First off, we are starting off with 10 pounds of ground beef. So I am just getting that cut up and put into the pot. If you've been following my channel and you watched one of my recent videos, we did a Sam's haul and a Sam's trip, and this is 10 pounds that we got from Sam's. So I am now I bought two of them. One I put up and processed and put into separate 2-pound packages using a food saver into the freezer. So I now have 10 pounds of ground beef in the freezer, but I also am wanting to put some on the shelf to make it shelf stable. That way, if our power ever went out, which I also kind of explained before, that if our power ever went out, we would have easy access to meals that all we had to do was warm it up. We didn't have to cook it necessarily. And we've had problems in the past where we used to lose our power all the time at our old house. Thankfully at this house we don't. However, at the old house it really taught me how to be prepared and things that we needed and what made life a lot easier if we were to lose power. And so that is one of my reasons for doing this. I just want to make it to where we can have easy grab, ready to go ground beef on the shelf that I can either turn into sloppy joes or chili or tacos or all kinds of different options that you use ground beef for. And it makes it a lot easier, and that way we just had a ready to go meal. I now have all 10 pounds of ground beef in the pot, and I placed water just above the ground beef. I filled it with water just so that it reaches kind of above the ground beef, and I want to take either a spoon or masher or whatever you happen to have and grind it up. That way it separates all of it, kind of like you would see in ground beef. And I don't want it to clump and cook in large balls or clumps. I'm just going to boil mine. For this recipe and for canning today, instead of taking a large pan and kind of frying it, I decided to boil it to make it a little bit easier. I will be the first to admit that it is not pretty as you're cooking it, nor does it smell great. However, once it's cooked and in the jars, we will be thankful and happy that we have it. This is my Presto canner, and it's, I believe, a 23 quart. That's the dial that tells you the pressure level that you need to keep it at. This spout is lets off steam, and that is the device, the little piece that pops up when you have pressure in your canner. If you ever see that popped up, you do not want to try to open the lid. This is your weight that you put on the spout after you vent it for 10 minutes, which again, I'll kind of explain as we go. And this is the disc that creates a protective layer between the jars and the pot. Now that I have that in the bottom, I am going to go ahead and place my jars in the pot. Chose to do 5 quart size jars. You can do pint, quarts, whatever you happen to use the most of, but try to think about what your family uses and how much ground beef your family uses at a time. 1 pound goes in about a pint size, and 2 pounds of ground beef goes in about a quart size. My family, anytime we make recipes, anytime we cook, we always do about 2 pounds of meat at a time. So for my family, it makes more sense for me to do quart size rather than pint size. I did place 1 pint size jar in there just in case I happen to have more than what would fit in the quart size jars. And however, I found out later on that it actually was perfect. It worked out great. I ended up not needing that pint size. Once I put my jars in the bottom of the pot, you want to fill the pot with about 2 inches of water and put a little bit of water in each of the jars. You're not going to need that later, but for now it helps keep them from floating and knocking into each other. So put a little bit of water in each of the jars and then fill the bottom of the pot with about 2 inches of water and place it on the stove to let it start simmering. You do not want the jars to go to a boil. You just want to get it to where it's kind of simmering and you see those little baby bubbles everywhere. If it goes any more than that, then you need to turn it down just a little bit. When pressure canning ground beef, you need some sort of liquid to put over the ground beef. I made a mess there that I had to clean up, but that's okay. You have to have a liquid to be able to put over the ground beef to can it in. And I chose to do chicken broth because I thought that would give it extra flavor. I could regret this later, but this is new, so we're going to try it. If we don't like it, I'll try water next time. You can do water, tomato juice, chicken broth, whatever you prefer. If you do the tomato juice, it kind of starts limiting what you're able to use it for in different meals. But the chicken broth, you have to be careful because you're supposed to put it in the refrigerator overnight and then scrape off the fat that builds onto the top of the chicken broth, especially because this was homemade chicken broth. A lot of times if you use stuff from the store, then it already has had that done. You don't have to do that. However, if you use homemade chicken broth, which is what I did, you want to try to be able to scrape off the fat from the top. Now, I'm hoping that I don't regret this because I did not do that. This is something that I just totally forgot. I'm hoping I don't regret it later because I went ahead and used it anyway. However, when I'm recording this video now and looking back, it turns out just fine. I haven't opened a can, so hopefully it still tastes fine too. They did all seal too, which was the other thing that I would be worried about because the fat can cause them to not seal properly. I have everything on the stove and my eyes on the stove are very kind of wonky. Some are super tiny, some are bigger, so sometimes I have to play musical pots and move pots around to get everything to fit. But the 3 pots that I had going were the chicken broth that we need to bring up to boil, the ground beef that is currently cooking, as well as the pots that are with the jars in it that are simmering. Here you see a pot that I put a colander in, and I drained off the ground beef grease because you do not want the grease to be in the ground beef when you cook it. Again, that goes back to what we were just talking about. The more fat that you have in there, the more likely that the ground beef will spoil faster, as well as it will increase the risk of your lids not sealing properly. After I drained my ground beef, I did go ahead and quickly rinse it with cool water to go ahead and try to get as much of that grease off as possible. Now I just showed you distilled white vinegar, which you want to pour a little bit into a bowl or a cup and set aside because you're going to need that later on to wipe the rims off and try to get the grease and fat off the rims of the jar before canning them. You can put any spices that you want in the ground beef, up to 2 teaspoons for a quart and 1 teaspoon for a pint. I had planned to put salt in mine, a teaspoon of salt or two in each quart. However, if I'm being honest, I totally forgot and realized after I had canned them that I never actually put the salt in there. That is okay because it doesn't change the safety of canning the meat, and so I can still eat the meat. I just need to remember that it has no salt or no seasonings of any kind, and that way I just know I need to add it once I open the jar. You can do wide mouth jars or regular size mouth jars, and those are the two different rings that I showed you, the two different sizes. So just make sure you're looking at your jars and determine whether you're buying the correct lids as well as rings for your jars, whether they're wide mouth or regular. So now I'm just inspecting all of the rings for my jars. I didn't want to get any that are maybe rusty or dented because that obviously increases the risk of your jars not sealing properly. This is a headspace measuring tool that we will be using to measure 1-inch headspace for ground beef, and our funnel that makes it a lot easier to get all of the liquid as well as ground beef in the jars. And then you will definitely need a jar grabber or gripper so that you can take the jars out of hot water or into hot water without hurting yourselves. Here, I'm trying to decide the best route to go about doing this, whether I should do one jar at a time or maybe go ahead and pull all the jars out. I run the risk of the jars cooling off before I can get the ground beef and liquid into them by pulling them all out at one time. So I keep going back and forth how I'm going to do it. The video I watched, which is Homesteading Family, and I'll link that in the description. That way, if you want to watch mine or watch theirs or both, just to become familiarized with the recipe as well as how it's done both from both people. I'm such a visual learner, so it helps me to see and visualize other people, which is why I love YouTube so much. But you can go ahead and watch here. I've decided that I'm going to pull all of them out at one time. I'm just afraid if I try to do one at a time, then I'll just end up getting ground beef and liquid everywhere because I'm a messy person. In the homesteading video for Homesteading Family, she only did one at a time. I'm just so messy that I was afraid that that would not go over so well with me. So I decided finally to go ahead and pull all of them out, and that way I can fill them all with ground beef and all with liquid all at one time. I figured if I'm staying focused, I should be able to do it before the jars cool off too much. When we put the jars in the pot to simmer, we also put a little bit of water in the bottom so that they wouldn't start floating around and bumping into each other. So now I'm just pouring out that little bit of water into the pot. Now, when you're done taking the jars out, just make sure that you still have about 2 inches of water in there, that it didn't all of a sudden become half the pot is full of water. So just kind of be sure by the time you get the jars back in that there's still only about 2 inches of water in the bottom. And be careful not to burn yourself because the water is hot. Now that I have all the jars out, there's no water in them, I'm starting to use the funnel and fill each jar all the way up with ground beef. You want an inch headspace. However, with ground beef, once you've ground it, there's pockets of air in between the different beef pieces. And so in a moment, we will pack it down, and you need to do this. Otherwise, once you boil it or pressure can it, not boil it, excuse me, pressure can it, you'll see that there's a gap of liquid at the bottom and all the meat kind of floats up. Even though we're packing it down, I know you may be nervous that it will cause all of the ground beef to come out in one big clump, but that actually doesn't happen. There's no need to worry about that because of the fat that's in there. That's what I've learned at least, so we will find out once I open the first jar. But I pack it down, and then that way I don't get a huge, half an inch or inch of just liquid in the jar. I'm able to pack it and fill all the extra spaces and then put the liquid in it so that we bring it up to that 1 inch headspace. And what I mean by an inch headspace is the space that's between the beef or the meat to the lid of the very top of the jar. You want about an inch. And you'll see that I use that measuring device for the headspace that makes it a lot easier. A moment ago, I did go ahead and place the pot, the pressure canning pot with the 2 inches of water and the ring that's at the very bottom that I showed you earlier that you needed to have at the very bottom to sit the jars on so that they're not sitting directly on the bottom of the pot. Put all of that back on the stove and again let it simmer so that the water doesn't cool off and become too cold. The idea behind this is that you want everything to be about the same temperature. That is your goal. So the goal for the pot with the water in it, the ground beef, the jars, the chicken broth, all of it, you want it to all stay as warm as possible without, of course, boiling still. So you want, that way your jars don't run the risk of busting or cracking, and everything's about the same temperature. Sometimes as I'm filling this, you'll see that I take the funnel and I give the jar a little shimmy and a little shake. That way it helps the meat to kind of all go down and pack down in a little bit more, which we don't have to do. It just, again, your goal is to try to get as much ground beef in the jar with still having that 1-inch headspace at the top. Here's the 1-inch measuring stick, the headspace measuring stick, and I'm taking it and I'm actually using it to also kind of push down the ground beef. You'll see I'm kind of packing it down. This is what I was talking about before, and again, I don't mind saying it more than once during the video because it's a way for us to learn and become familiar with it, but packing down the ground beef. That way you don't have just an inch or two of liquid, and see how far it's going down. If I had not done this, all of that space up at the top of the jar, by the time we pressure can this, would have all been liquid or air. And obviously we don't want that. We want as much ground beef to fit in each jar as possible. And by doing this, you can see that it actually creates a lot of extra space that we can add more ground beef. And I just go through each jar and make sure that I'm kind of packing it all down, and then I'll go through and add more ground beef, and then we'll start doing our liquid on top of it. And you'll have to stop and kind of do this a little bit as you go. It's not something where you do it one time and you're all done. I went through and added more ground beef to each jar until I reached about an inch of headspace at the top, and then it was time to add our chicken broth. I had brought this chicken broth up to a boil. If you're using water, chicken broth, tomato juice, any of the above, you just want to bring it up to make it warm and hot like everything else. So you can bring it up to a boil. You don't need for it to sit there and boil. Just bring it up to the boil, then you can turn it off and use it. You can barely see it, but I did bring the chicken broth up all the way to just above the ground beef, and hopefully leaving about an inch of headspace still left. You can see I am kind of maneuvering ground beef around. I'm trying to avoid using that pint-sized jar, and it turns out that once I pack all of the ground beef down with the chicken broth inside of it, it ended up being just fine. It was perfect amount. 10 pounds fit into 5 quart-sized jars very well. You can do about 2 pounds in each quart size. So that ended up being perfect. And now I'm taking the measuring device for the headspace, and I'm also using it to debubble your jars. What that means is you want to put the stick, you can use a chopstick, a knife, a spoon, whatever you happen to have, and you want to take it and move the ground beef around in each jar to get out any pockets of air or bubbles that may be trapped in there, can cause your lids to not seal properly. I do this to each jar and then again go back and check headspace on each one and adjust the liquid or the ground beef as necessary. I believe I now have all the jars with 1-inch headspace, and I'm just double checking all of them. And here I'm about to show you what that looks like. The measuring stick right there almost looks like stairs. You put one edge of it on the rim of the lid, and then all the way down the stairs, it's actually labeled on there. You'll see 1 inch. And that's where you want it barely, ever so barely touching the top of the meat and or liquid that you're trying to pressure can or water bath can. Now that that is done, and I believe I have all of them measured out, I took the distilled white vinegar that we set aside earlier, and I'm rubbing down the rims all the way around of each jar. You want to do your best to get any fat, any grease, any kind of liquid, anything off the edge of the jar that could cause your lids to not seal properly. Once all of your rims to your jars have been wiped down with the white vinegar, it's time to get your lids and place them, just set them on top of each jar. And again, I'm just kind of double checking each lid to make sure that there's no dings or bends or anything like that, because I have opened a box before and there were some dings and bends on the lids, and you don't want that because again, it increases the risk of the seal to not work. And the other thing I want to point out to you is do your best not to touch the red part of the lid. Now I'm using the bulk canning lids, and those have a little red rubber seal, the part that seals down to seal the jar. Do your best not to touch those, because otherwise you're putting your oil from your skin and your hands on that lid. After you have all of your lids on there, take the rings and you want to twist them on finger tight. So that means you twist them until you meet resistance, and then just a little bit more than that. At this point, you may be asking yourself, why go through all of this trouble? Because it was an almost all day event. I make it look so much faster in this video because I've edited it and cut it down. However, it did take me a little while to cook the meat, get everything up to the right temperature, fill the jars, but the longest time that it took was the pressure canner and babysitting the pressure canner. So you may be asking yourself, why go through all this trouble? Well, I kind of mentioned it and touched on it before, but I like having shelf-stable foods on my shelf that I can grab in the heat of a moment if something crazy is happening or we lose power or anything like that. Having the access to shelf-stable beef that if we were to lose power, we don't have to start digging through our chest boxes and opening the freezers over and over again, causing that our meat that happens to be in there to go bad, or if we were to lose power for an extended period of time, which also happened at our old house, then we have the access to meat that doesn't go bad or doesn't spoil. So this is something that I really wanted to become good at and practice, which again, practice makes perfect. This may not be the best option that we have. I've never tried ground beef, and I only want to make stuff that we're actually going to eat. If we're not going to eat this, if I make it and it tastes terrible, then I will try a different way of preserving the food and making it shelf stable, or having options available of shelf stable foods that we will actually eat, because I don't want to go through all the effort of making stuff that is just going to sit on the shelf and go bad. I put the pressure canner on. I took the weighted gauge off, so you see the spout does not have the weighted gauge on it, and now you see the steam coming out, and there's the weighted gauge. You want that steady stream of steam coming out for 10 minutes. So it will take a while to get that up to there. I did not put that weight on until I saw 10 minutes of a steady, heavy steam stream coming up. And at the back there, you'll see that little thing pop up once you put the weighted gauge on. That means the pressure inside is building. Once you see that come up, do not try to open your lid. That would be a terrible idea. But up here, you see the dial on top of the lid is at a 10. And therefore, I started my timer a while back. It's at 10. For ground beef, I have to pressure can it for 90 minutes. That means because of my elevation of where I live, I'm less than 1,000 feet above sea level, which means that I need to hold the pressure at that 10, maybe 11 for an hour and a half. When you put your pot on to start bringing the pressure up, you want to start it off slow. It's easy to want to crank that up and keep it up high and cause it to bring up to pressure faster. However, if you do that, it becomes very unstable and difficult to keep that pressure. So I usually put mine on a 4. I don't know how your stove is, but I usually put mine on a 4, which is kind of medium-ish pressure or medium-ish temperature. And that way it can bring it up slowly. Slow and steady wins the race. That is your best option. And once you finally have it up to pressure of 10, then you set your timer, because you cannot start the timer at anything below 10. Otherwise, you still run the risk of there being bacteria in your jars. After I reached 90 minutes of 10 pounds of pressure for my elevation, I turned the stove off and I did not touch my pressure canner at all. I let it fully come depressurize on its own. And to be honest, I let it sit there for the rest of the day until it was plenty of time. And you'll see that little thing that popped up on the back of the pot fall down. And when you see that, it should be safe to open. However, I usually let it sit there for a while just to be on the safe side. But here are the jars, and I let them finish sitting out on the counter and cooling overnight before I take the rings off and set them on the shelf. I also gently wash them with soap and warm water. When you take them out of the pressure canning pot, they end up having a little bit of grease because of the water siphoning out of them, and that's normal. That's okay. Just wash them gently with warm water and soap and before you set them on your shelves. Things that you may see after pressure canning meat that are normal are little fat layers at the top, as well as if there's a little bit of meat above a liquid layer, that's normal, and you may see a little bit of a layer of liquid at the bottom of the jar, and that's fine too. I just want to take this time to say thank you so much for joining me. I hope this was helpful, and if you have any questions about pressure canning or water bath canning, feel free to ask me down in the comments below. Please like, subscribe, and share, and thank you so much for joining me.